Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Nilanthan. Well, US President Donald Trump certainly turned the rules-based world order on its head last Saturday when he sent over 150 military aircraft and hundreds of troops in to snatch Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro right out of wherever he was in the capital Caracas and took him all the way to New York, where he is charged with various narcotics offenses. But what does this mean for the rest of the world? Are we now living in a world where powerful countries can simply march in to smaller countries and do whatever they please? That just seems so ludicrous because for nearly a century the world has been trying to move towards some international order. And to discuss all this, I have with me an expert in international relations, and that is none other than Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, CLAS. Good evening and welcome back to the show, Nilanthan.
Good evening, interesting times.
That's putting it mildly, yes. Interesting and rather disconcerting. Because we do like to live in a world which has rules and some semblance of order, and then when the most powerful country on earth just disregards all civilized rules, all conventions, and goes ahead and does whatever it pleases, this opens up a lot of issues around the world, and smaller countries like ours and many, there's 100 countries which are perhaps smaller than us. And what does it mean for all of those countries? Can the larger powers just walk in? What is the situation here, Nilanthan?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question that you raised, because, as you said, this seems to be quite transformative in terms of how we think of potential threats from abroad. So, of course, we had the Noriega extraction from Panama under George Bush Sr. But in general, when a small country worries about a larger country militarily, you tend to think of an Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine type. Even now when we talk about China and Taiwan, the conventional discussions are all about what if there's an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. But what this does is expose a completely new vulnerability now that we all need to worry about, which is the idea that a quick 3-hour operation can be undertaken where your air defenses are taken out, several installations are taken out, and some team that knows the presence of your head of state can essentially infiltrate and extract you to another country. So I think most countries have always been aware that the strong ignore the rules and play by their own norms. I think most countries are already aware of that. But what this does is expose a completely new risk, which I don't think many leaders around the world have really calculated for so far. And that's perhaps the point of this itself. It's to make sure that many of the other regional Latin American leaders understand that taking up an anti-American position is not going to be in their interest. So it's a very hardline tactic in order to send out a clear message to Latin America to get in line, so to speak.
Right. Now you raised a very interesting point. This is not just about Venezuela. It is about the entire Western Hemisphere, that is North America, South America, and what we call Central America and the Caribbean, because President Trump repeatedly spoke of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine we thought it was an outdated sort of philosophy of the United States, which basically wanted to keep the European powers out of the Americas. But would you like to explain the Monroe Doctrine a little bit to our viewers?
Yes, so it's exactly as you said. It is the idea that the United States has the right to exercise a sovereign supremacy in the Western Hemisphere, as in they can prevent external powers. At that time they meant the Europeans, but how it should be interpreted is any external powers in general from setting a foothold. I mean, you've got to remember, the Americans chased the Spaniards away from Cuba until the Russians then came in through the Cold War. The Americans have always fought for some kind of ideological dominance in the Americas, and they'll continue to do so. This is probably Trump's national security strategy that came out a few weeks ago. That's probably the first time since 1904 or 1905 that South America has been given such prominence in how America views the external world. It's always been about, over the last century or so, prioritizing Europe, sometimes the Middle East, different parts of the world. But it's been over a century since an American president put on paper that the Western Hemisphere was their main interest. And this is why, as we were discussing before the show as well, we need to understand what's happening with the energy markets, with what's happening with the dollar, what's happening with the American strategic posture. There are many transformations that are happening, all of which directly contributed to this very worrying event, as you pointed out.
Right. So, Nilanthan, the immediate reason given for snatching President Maduro was that he was involved in cocaine trafficking into the United States and things like that. But when President Trump made his speech after this operation, he made it very clear that it's not about cocaine, it's about oil. If it was just about Maduro and cocaine, well, they've got Maduro. He's in New York. He's facing charges. Right. So leave Venezuela alone. Right. But instead, Trump went much further and said that the U.S. government would be running the country of Venezuela. Which is a sovereign country. It's not a small country either, and it has vast amounts of oil. And he went even further and said that the oil would be America's oil, that US oil companies would be investing billions of dollars into Venezuela's oil industry, and that the US companies would get the wealth, as well as, of course, the Venezuelan people would be also given their share of the wealth, but that US companies would be profiting from this. So this seems a bit like piracy on the high seas to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's
all he was missing was the Jolly Roger.
Yeah, it's been a good week for Exxon and Chevron and all that, who have all seen their sort of prospects now increase. Because, I mean, let's look at the 5 largest proven crude oil reserves in the world, right? Number 1, Venezuela. Number 2, Saudi Arabia. Number 3, Iran. Number 4, Canada. Number 5, Iraq. Now, we only need to go through these 5 countries alone to understand what's going on here. That there's a huge energy dimension to the geopolitical, geostrategic chessboard. And many of these are moves on that geostrategic chessboard as well. Now, as you said, it would be our oil, we would be running it and all that. So, all of this is part of a strategy to now homogenize the energy sector in the Western Hemisphere. Because, as I said, when we look at what's going on in the energy markets over the last 2 years, many nations like Canada and many of the EU nations, which over the last 10 to 15 years invested very heavily in an environmental future where they were trying to shut out fossil fuels and transition into renewable energy. That is unfortunately not happening. Now, there are two reasons for this. The first is that China is a major giant in the renewable energy market, and the Western countries have a much more natural advantage in terms of fossil fuel supply than they do over China. So if this renewable energy transition happens, it's China that gains everything. That's one. The second is that the industries themselves, for economic reasons mostly, don't want to adopt renewable. So renewable energy has made a lot of progress in electricity generation, light bulbs, electrical appliances and so on, but that's less than 20% of the world's global energy consumption. Every electrical appliance could go green, and 80% of the world's energy demand would still depend on fossil fuels. So the major industries like plastic, steel, concrete, fertilizer, these four industries alone guzzle up more energy than most other industries combined, and they're all very dependent on fossil fuels. If we look at data centers, AI data centers, that's going to be the next major consumer of energy going forward, completely run on fossil fuels. They're like, we can't afford to use renewable energy because it's not giving us a return and all that. So the United States has realized that fossil fuels are here to stay. The energy transition that a lot of people thought was coming, it's not really going to happen as quickly as any of us thought, and therefore securing the Western Hemisphere's energy potential is extremely critical for their long-term planning. And the way that a guy like Trump would see it is, oh, we have a whole gold mine here, and you have a bunch of these problematic little dictators bearing their fangs, so let's just show them what happens if they bare their fangs. That is, it's a very, as I said, a very hardline way of looking at the world. As you said, over the last 75 to 80 years, we've built an international world order, or at least we've claimed to have built an international world order that abides by certain norms. And what we are seeing here is one of the final death knells of that order. But to me, this is all about securing the US dollar. We can go into that if you're interested, but predominantly it's about bringing Canada, USA, Latin America, all of those huge energy deposits under one strategic umbrella, who are all thinking the same way.
Right, and you mentioned Canada a couple of times, and there is a huge oil deposit in Canada which is now being tapped.
Absolutely. So a few weeks ago, the state government of Alberta signed an agreement with the government of Canada, agreeing to allow Alberta to now start fossil fuel industries again, because for a long time traditional fuel industries were finding it very hard to grow in Canada, because Canada was going green in terms of really pressuring people to come on board the renewable energy transition. And a lot of these economies were suffering because of that, because these were oil rich regions that were now not being allowed to utilize the natural resources that they have. So you see now Canada going back to that shift as well. So Canada is unlocking its energy superpower potential. Venezuela is already an energy superpower that just needs the infrastructure. I mean, when we look at how much oil Venezuela was exporting, let's say 15 years ago, and compare it to what they're doing now, it's a fraction of what a healthy economy should be exporting or could be exporting. So if the United States could just make all of these guys come under one strategic umbrella, where all of this oil was being sold in dollars to the rest of the world, then that really sets them up for both economic and currency stronghold over the rest of the world for the foreseeable time frame, unfortunately.
Now, Nilanthan, when we talk about oil, we in Sri Lanka have traditionally thought, well, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and so on. But there is a massive wealth of oil in South America at the northern tip of it, particularly Venezuela and its neighbor Guyana.
Yes.
And it's very interesting that Guyana's oil wealth was discovered only a couple of years ago, and the economy is booming. The economy of Guyana is growing at over 20% per annum, and there was a threat from neighboring Venezuela to invade and take over a large part of Guyana, because there's a disputed territory. But immediately the Western powers closed ranks, and Guyana, of course, is a former UK colony, and the UK practically threatened to send troops and ensure that Venezuela does not use military force on Guyana. So this is all about oil, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it will become more about oil going into the future as well. My point is that this is simply the beginning of the second innings of oil, the oil geopolitical game. So for a while there was a small freeze, but now this is essentially, as I said, the second innings, or whatever you want to call it. Look, the irony is that countries like Guyana, countries like Chile, that do play the American game, end up becoming rich. And the countries that refuse, like, I mean, Cuba now has, several hours of power cuts per day. Venezuela used to be a wealthy country, now an extremely poor country. So that's the contradiction there. We talk about sovereignty and independence and all that, but economically, it's the countries that cooperate with the United States who've all succeeded because of the money, because there's just so much money to be made here. But but Latin America in general is very suspicious of the United States, just like how Eastern Europe is naturally suspicious of Russia, just like how Southeast Asia naturally suspicious of China, and so on. When you're a big power, your neighbors, your smaller neighbors, will always treat you with a certain level of suspicion. But my point is that the countries that play the American game will start seeing their economies really ramping forward, and this will be the actual way in which you homogenize South American energy infrastructure. The Venezuelas, the Colombias, the Cubas of the world are the small obstacles here. And I think now the conventional thinking is that if you can get rid of, who knows, Cuba might be next, we don't know. Iran might be next, we don't know. Greenland might be next, who knows. But the whole idea is that there are just a few of these guys in our way to making a ton of money, so let's just get rid of those guys.
And in fact, Trump has already threatened the neighboring country, Colombia.
Yes. So Colombia has been very anti-American in its rhetoric as well. So the whole point is, this is what happens. If you want to stand in the flags of your capital saying, hey, Trump, touch me if you can.
Which is what
Maduro did. He was in the streets of Venezuela, Caracas, challenging Donald Trump. So the message is, Gaddafi did the same thing 15 years ago, where he essentially challenged the Western powers to lay a finger on him if they dared. And they dared. So that's the contradiction there.
Now, Nilanthan, we saw with the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, the rise of the Western powers, and then we saw with the rise of China and India and the resurgence of Russia, the dominance of the Western powers actually seemed to reduce a bit worldwide. And everyone was talking about the Chinese influence across Asia, in many countries in Africa, and indeed in South America as well. But with this one military operation, has Donald Trump upended all this and asserted definitive dominance of the United States on the world as a whole?
So if we look at the strategic discourse inside Russia and China, that certainly seems to be the case. Where inside Russia and China, the conversation is, look at what the United States can do in its own backyard, and all of us have to just sit back and watch. For all our talk of intercontinental ballistic missiles and 5th generation, 6th generation aircraft and all that, the rest of us just have to sit back and watch while Ukraine is resisting Russia because of Western aid and weapons and technology. And if China tries to invade Taiwan tomorrow, the entire Western alliance in Southeast Asia itself, which has American military bases all over, is going to get mobilized. So this proves, once again, as you said, there was a lot of talk that somehow the Russians and the Chinese militarily now are gaining an advantage, and Chinese weapons, Chinese hardware, Russian hardware, whenever it's been tested, unfortunately, so for example, even before last year's Iran-Israel conflict, if you remember in 2024, an Israeli F-35 plane flew right into Iranian territory, took out a whole bunch of targets. The Russian S-300 air defense systems could do nothing. Here you once again have F-35s present to help with this operation as well. You have Russian S-300 anti-aircraft defense technology in Venezuela. They were taken out, they couldn't do anything, right? In actual practical applications, American tech just wins almost every time that we see over Russian and Chinese tech and all that. And China has one military base in Djibouti, outside of China. Russia has a few in its periphery, the Eastern European, Central Asian nations. The famous overseas base that it had was the Tata base in Syria, that they had to just sit back and watch collapse when the Syrian revolution happened. The Americans, on the other hand, have military installations and bases all over the world. Economic power is very different from military power. China is now the largest trading partner of the world, and for a long time that was being touted as an example of a new era where China was going to call the shots. This is a very clear example of how wielding economic power and wielding military power are two completely different ball games.
Right, and so we seem to have been living through a very pivotal point in history over the last few days, and we will continue this discussion in a few minutes. We'll take a short break now. I'm in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan of the Center for Law and Security Studies. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. Now, Nilanthan, a question about the US dollar. Now, this is known as the world's reserve currency. In other words, when two countries or two companies in different countries are trying to trade with each other, generally the global banking system is based on the US dollar. So, it doesn't matter whether you're sending money from Sri Lanka to the UK or Sri Lanka to Australia or whatever, the US dollar comes into play. It is the world's reserve currency, and especially in international commodities, everything is priced in US dollars, and it's not priced in Indian rupees or Chinese yuan or whatever. There are some instances where two countries which are neighboring, such as India and Sri Lanka, will accept each other's currency in a small way, but generally the world depends on this US dollar, and the United States economy depends on this in a big way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The US supremacy is completely dependent on the supremacy of the US dollar. And this is why countries insist on securing the sea lanes to make their currency a global reserve currency of sorts. So if you look at the Portuguese Empire in the 1400s and 1500s, they used their fleet to make sure that Portuguese currency was the most popular one. If you look at the Dutch currency a few hundred years later, which is generally considered by economic historians to be the first ever reserve currency, and then once the Dutch Empire went away, the British did that with the pound, and then once that went away, the Americans now asserted that with the US dollar as well. So essentially, your ability to print money without having to worry about debt and the consequences, all of that comes from being the reserve currency of the world. So something like 90% of all foreign exchange, foreign currency transactions that happen in the world happen in US dollars. So even though its value as a reserve asset is going down, the prominence of it in transactions is still very popular. Now, this is a very important point because this plugs directly into what we are discussing today. So if I could just explain, the US dollar currently faces three potential challenges. The first is the challenge from another fiat currency, as in from another currency backed by another government. So some people have their hopes pegged into some kind of BRICS common currency. The Americans are not that worried about it because they feel that this is going to be a long-term thing. They don't see why China would cripple its own economic growth by linking its currency with a volatile economy like South Africa. They don't see Russia linking its currency with Brazil, which is in the backyard of the US. They don't see India and China going along a fiscal system where Beijing would have to provide the green light for any major change. So many people do say that a BRICS currency is emerging, but that's a long-term play. That's the first threat to the US dollar from other fiat currencies. The second threat is from other commodities, such as gold. So now that people would rather own gold rather than US Treasury bills, because if you own US Treasury bills, it can be weaponized against you at any point of time, like what happened with Russian assets and stuff like that. So people just want to invest in gold. And the third threat is from cryptocurrencies. US dollar versus crypto, where you have a lot of people saying that the future of currency is going to be digital and crypto. Now, that third weakness was somewhat addressed by what's called the Genius Act that was passed a few months ago by the Trump administration, which provides tokenized dollars, as in tokens that are pegged to the value of the US dollar. So the convenience of cryptocurrency you get with that. But the other two threats were never addressed. That is gold, and especially the threat from other fiat currency. So if the United States can unlock Venezuela's oil potential, and if they can make sure that that is sold in US dollars, what that means is yet another very strong foothold for the US dollar to retain its supremacy around the world. In fact, if you look at the national security strategy released by the Trump regime, you have this stated explicitly. We will work to preserve the supremacy of the US dollar. We will work to unlock the energy potential of the Western Hemisphere. All of this is already written out on paper. And the the temporary invasion of Venezuela for the extraction of the leader of Venezuela, a big part of that, this is all part of this response to the threats that the dollar is being assailed from on all levels, from other fiat currencies, from other commodities, and from digital alternatives.
Now, Nilanthan, in the past, we have seen that the US government, successive regimes, and the US military, they work very hard to ensure that the world's reserve currency remains the US dollar. And one is reminded of the fact that at least two other national leaders who tried to move away from the US dollar were simply deposed. I'm talking about Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, both who publicly proclaimed that they would be selling oil, in euros and other currencies. And what happened to both of them?
Yeah, so it's selling oil in your own currency and essentially violating the petrodollar. That's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, because the United States has hundreds of military installations all over the world in 50-60 different countries. If you think they're just going to sit back and do nothing while you try to tear down the system that this entire infrastructure has been built to preserve, then you have another thing coming. The entire fleet of American military power that's ready to exercise and project force at any point, geographic point in the world, that is all built for the singular purpose of retaining the supremacy of the US dollar. Just like how the Portuguese existed for that, the Dutch Navy existed for that, the British Navy existed for that. The reason you do power projection is to essentially secure interests like this. So they're not going to sit back and do nothing while you go into this transition.
So this is all about petrodollars, power projection, economics. In the end, it is money, isn't it?
Absolutely. I don't want to deny that the cartels are a problem, because the cartels have been a major problem. And I don't want to deny that the cartels have a major influence in terms of government administration in Venezuela. So the police, for example, one of the major criticisms of that the Venezuelan opposition party makes is that the Venezuelan police essentially is yet another part of the cartels. So there is there, but as far as the bigger picture is concerned, I would be very stubborn that this is much more about, as you said, the dollar and energy rather than the cartels, while not being dismissive of the threat that the cartels have imposed on certain parts of the United States.
Well, it is quite true that the cocaine cartels have been a major issue for the whole world, basically, but especially the United States. But the cartels have been around forever. Ronald Reagan, in the early 80s, had his war on drugs, and it was the Colombian cartels that he was fighting.
Yes.
And those cartels are, perhaps not those cartels, but Colombia still has cartels, Venezuela has, and they're all over South America and Central America. So it's not, it's not really just about the cartels. It is much more than
it's that. About much more. And even with the cartels, the oil, now Chevron is operating in Venezuela, but your typical Chevron and Exxons and the energy producers are going to feel much safer setting up shop in Venezuela if you can wipe out the cartels as well. So there's an added kind of aspect where the two come together as well. Flushing out this system also means that your oil companies can have a much more stable time in operating in Venezuela.
Well, interestingly, when you look at the technology used in this military operation, and it wasn't just hitting that one base where Maduro was living. They hit about half a dozen bases in, I think, Caracas and three states or provinces in Venezuela, so across the country, ensuring that there would be no military interference with this operation on the part of the Venezuelan forces. But it strikes me that people like Putin must be kicking themselves, because now Putin went to war against the Ukraine for almost these same reasons, because he wanted to dominate that part of the world, which is Ukraine, which is neighboring Russia, and all he had to do was to stage a strike like this and carry off Zelensky. But instead he went to war, and now, what is it, 3 years since that war started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if he had just done this to take out Zelensky, we could have avoided this entire war. Remember, in 2003, getting rid of Saddam Hussein was the easy part. It was retaining control of Iraq once a civil war broke down between the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds. That's when the country then devolved into bloodshed for years and years and years. Getting rid of Saddam, that's the easy part. So if you just focus on that, your chances of success are much higher. But typically, as we discussed earlier, for whatever reason, these superpowers, they just want to invade. And they want this big staged operation, and it works against them. I mean, the Cholas in historical times, their conquests were not based on coming up with an army and conquering you through land. They would just arrive with a few ships and sack your capital city and kill your leadership, and then it would be Chola territory. This is very similar to that sort of style of conquest, where it's a quick 3-hour operation, where you take out the leader that you think is in your way, and then if necessary you can repeat that strike over and over again.
Right. And what lessons can we take from this for Sri Lanka? And just for once, I'm happy we don't have oil.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any threat of any country invading us and taking away our leaders. But what can we get from this new world order which has come about?
So I would say there's a public and a private lesson to be learned here. I think the private sector needs to at least now wake up and realize that investing in actual geostrategic knowledge is important for the planning of their own business strategies. And actually, my think tank class, we've teamed up with one of the leading business strategy guys in Sri Lanka called Innovation Quotient, and the two of us are going to start coming up with geostrategic workshops to help businesses in Sri Lanka incorporate geostrategic thinking into their operations and how to view the world and all that, because as you know, that kind of knowledge is fundamental for a country like us. But you don't get the private sector here investing in that kind of knowledge, but in a turbulent world you have to. On the public side, this is a conversation that you and I have had several times on this show, which is you need policy continuity. What do you do when there's turbulence around you? At least try to steady yourself. But we are far away from that conversation as well, where, as we've discussed many times, our foreign policy is completely the hostage of whoever's in power. I become the president, I take us in one direction, you become the president, you take us in another direction. So the only solution to turbulence is stability and knowledge. The private sector here needs knowledge, and the public sector needs stability and continuity. Because more than seeing this as, oh, can somebody just come and abduct our president, the much graver threat is that we live in a world where that becomes commonplace, where it's not necessary for us to be on that hit list, for us to be affected by it. Just living in a world where this becomes the norm, that itself is something that a small, economically weak country like us has to put a lot of thought and effort into.
Right, and we are almost out of time, but one final question, Nilanthan. What does this mean for, our regular visit to Geneva, where every year we get hauled up there as though we are being taken to the principal's office and lectured about human rights. Perhaps rightly so, because we do, over the decades, we have had massive human rights issues. But now, when you have the US government just, making a mockery of all types of rights here, nations, the sovereignty of nations, and human rights. I mean, they killed over 100 people in this strike in several areas of Venezuela, including apparently civilians as well as Venezuelan soldiers and Cuban soldiers who were guarding Maduro.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for this whole human rights spectrum, not just for Sri Lanka but for the world?
Well, what it means is that the entire thing is a scam. That's what the parents tell their children about Santa Claus, hoping that they will behave, but Santa Claus is a fictional concept. And for whatever reason, the idea of international criminal enforcement for powerful nations is as fictional as Santa Claus. You can tell them, like you tell kids, that if you misbehave, the International Criminal Court is going to take you away, like how Santa would put a piece of coal in your sock or whatever. But the two are equally fictional concepts. The idea of an international criminal court punishing an American president for violating the law is as likely as Santa punishing you and I for being bad boys during Christmas. So what this shows is that that system does not really exist for the strong. During Talk of the Town earlier, you asked me whether the US was a bully. The biggest bully is the International Criminal Court. All it ever does is pick on bankrupt African dictatorships. Since it's, I mean, they pressure the weak and they kowtow to the strong. That's the definition of a bully, where you attack the weak and you then bow to the strong. And that's the definition of what the International Criminal Court has been doing since its establishment.
Well, interestingly enough, the United States has never signed on to the international.
The Rome Statute. They never will, yeah.
So they're not bound by it at all.
Never.
And neither have many of the other larger countries in the world,
Yes.
including, I think, India and...
Yeah, I mean, and so if, for example, the Rome Statute itself, many people came on board only once they realized that it was a joke. So you had the initial signatories who were genuinely about that vision, but it became very clear within a few years that this entire thing was just, you have to call it the African Criminal Court. I object to it being called the International, it's an African Criminal Court that targets Africans. Once in a while you might get some unknown speck from East Asia or South America or something that's being targeted, but in general it's the African Criminal Court, right, not the international
one. And you had a few from the Serbia, Bosnia,
but they set up special courts for Rwanda, for Serbia and all that either. The International Criminal Court wasn't even around when that happened.
Right. And what is your prediction over the next few weeks and months about what's going to happen to Venezuela and the whole of South America? What's it, do you see bloodshed? Do you see a second invasion, a larger invasion by US troops, as President Trump said he's ready to do? Do you see the Venezuelan government bowing down to the Trump administration? And what about the rest of South America, Colombia and Brazil, Argentina, Chile, all of them? What's going to happen in this?
So I think a ground invasion of Venezuela, I would say, is still unlikely. Trump is very trigger happy with missile strikes. So Nigeria, Syria, Yemen, Iran, right, now Venezuela, but they've all been singular military operations rather than military campaigns. US presidents before Trump came into the scene were all about military campaigns, and this is what he criticized as the forever wars. Trump is very trigger happy with singular individual military operations, like what he did in Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran and all that, and he brags about it on Twitter, and after that he's moved on to the next thing, typically. So I wouldn't discount the idea of a ground invasion, but this method seems to be a lot easier than an actual ground invasion, because you only need Chevron and Exxon and all that to be allowed to operate in peace. That's all you need. You're not looking to introduce democracy to Venezuela. You're not looking, when Trump says we're going to run the country, what he means is they're going to take the oil decisions that we want them to take. But he's not going to regulate what Venezuelans should wear, what they should eat. This is not a traditional American, we are saving you with democracy type thing, where they are here to upend your entire culture. This is just let our oil companies operate there and sell those things in dollars and we'll be fine.
Right, and indeed in this whole discourse over Venezuela over the last few days, we have seen the absence of those terms, democracy and human rights. No one seems to be talking about that at all.
We are not going to hear them for a while, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, and I'm afraid that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you very much, Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies class. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.